Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris, and we're going to continue our study on Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through verses 1 through 6. There we go. And we've been talking about the idea that Paul says the law stirred up sinful passions in us. How could that be? The law's good. The law comes from God. So what did Paul mean exactly? Well, could we be misreading this? Maybe what he meant is that we're dead to sin. Now, sin does indeed entice us. He wasn't saying that the law entices us. He said that sin does. All right, now that would make sense, except for the fact that in verse 5 there, he says, it is the law that arouses our sinful passions. So if God, who's against sin, gave us the law, how is that? How is it that law was getting people in the mood to sin? I want you to try something for me right now. I'm going to give you a couple seconds here. I want you to count to 5. And while you are counting to 5, do not think of an orange elephant. Ready, go. You thought of an orange elephant, didn't you? Of course you did. I planted the idea. Maybe Paul meant that the law describes sin, and that plants the idea in us, and that gets us all riled up. So if it wasn't for the law, we'd never think of the sin. Come on. Did the law invent sin? No. Does the law entice us to sin? No. We come up with that stuff on our own. So what did Paul mean here? Well, I think the answer as to discovering what Paul meant by the law stirring up those passions in us, I think the answer is in the difference between hoping that you're loved and knowing that you're loved. Now, let me explain. Paul says that grace lets us serve God. Okay? Doesn't the law let us serve God too? Well, apparently not. Let's look again at verse 5. Verse 5 says, for when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in us, so that we bore fruit for death. Under the law, we were bearing fruit for death. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you live under the law, what are you trying to do? You're trying to be good enough that God will be convinced to love you. You're trying to earn his love. That's how the system worked. At least that's how people thought the system worked. You had to earn God's love. But what does that end up leading us to do? If a whole system of law boils down to you trying to live in a way that will convince God to love you, then how would you really approach his law? You know what you do? You would look for loopholes. How can I technically keep the law so God will love me? That's just human nature. It's what the Pharisees did all the time. The Pharisees would do things like they would say, you can't work on the Sabbath. Okay, yeah, that's what God's law says. That means we don't plow on the Sabbath, that we don't work our fields on the Sabbath. They would go so far, though, the Pharisees, as to say, no, you can't do any work. But I mean, some work had to be done, like you had to get water. So you could go to the well and get water. But the problem was you couldn't tie your bucket to the rope to lower it down because tying a knot was work on the Sabbath. But it was okay for women to tie their girdles on the Sabbath. So I wish I was making this up. They said if you want to get water from the well, you have to tie your bucket with a girdle. Is this really what God's law meant? No. They were looking for loopholes. And if your main concern is looking for loopholes, how worried are you about genuinely drawing close to God? You see, that was the whole point of the law. It was to get us to avoid sin so we could draw close to God. And if your whole intention is to look for loopholes, I'm sorry, you're not even interested in trying to get close to God. In reality, you're drifting away from God. And if you're drifting away from God, what are you drifting towards? Yeah, exactly. And that's how the law actually aroused sinful passions in us. The law itself, just this effort to behave and to look for loopholes and to look for all these intricate little pieces, it wasn't getting our minds on God. It was drawing us away. And that's how the law arouses sinful passions in us. So if the system of law really made people just look for loopholes, not for God, and that drew them away, then think about what a system of grace will do. Look at verse 6 now. Verse 6 says, "But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code." We serve in the new way of the Spirit. Under the law, you're not even trying to get to God. You're trying to get God to love you based on your track record, but really you're not trying to get to God. You're just looking to obey a set of rules. But under grace, that love is already there. You don't have to earn it. And that's everything. And no, that doesn't mean we have a license to sin now. It means that we know God loves us. Even if we mess up, even if we blow it, even if we blow it repeatedly, God's love is already there. We are loved people. Being loved people is what this is all about. And I'm going to tell you something. Knowing you're loved makes a difference. It makes an enormous difference. Children who grow up knowing they are loved makes all the difference in the world for them. Loved people act differently. People who know they are loved live differently. Years ago, a movie came out based on the life of Richard Nixon. It was called Nixon. And there was one line in that movie that just stuck with me. Whoever the actor was playing Henry Kissinger, I don't remember who he was speaking to, but he was talking about Nixon, and I remember distinctly what he said. He said, "Can you imagine what this man would be like if anyone had ever loved him?" The point was that his paranoia was from never feeling loved, never feeling that it was just given, but he had to earn it. That affected everything. It affects everything when we think we have to earn being loved. But when we know God automatically loves us, oh, that's that. Now you're talking about a change of heart. We'll talk more about this next time. Till then, have a great day.